In the corporate world, blood does not stain $1,000 carpets. It flows quietly through contract loopholes. When they kicked me out with a cheap cardboard box and a condescending smile, they thought they were removing a roadblock. They did not realize they had pulled the pin on a financial grenade I buried deep inside a $2 billion project. Grab a strong coffee. This $250,000 a day lesson is about to begin. Hello, listeners of the Boss Revenge Stories channel. Thank you so much for your continued support. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon, where you can listen to even more incredible, exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the comments section of this video. Now, let us begin today's story about a woman named Sienna Rivera. My name is Sienna Rivera. I was 34 years old and held the dual title of Chief Architect and Director of Environmental Compliance at Aura Prime Development. Aura Prime was one of those massive corporate real estate behemoths that swallowed entire city blocks for breakfast. It was a place where executives operated under the profound delusion that a slick PowerPoint presentation could somehow solve structural engineering flaws. Our undisputed crown jewel was the Green Valley project located in Austin, Texas. It was a massive, sprawling undertaking valued at a staggering $2 billion. My job was far from glamorous. I was never the face smiling on the industry magazine covers, and I certainly did not attend the extravagant charity galas. I was the anchor. I was the singular, relentless force, keeping the entire $2 billion operation from being permanently shut down by a crushing labyrinth of strict carbon emissions regulations, brutal land assessments, and unforgiving federal permits. While the upper management clinked crystal champagne glasses on the top floor, I spent my long days wading through toxic soil reports and negotiating fiercely with state environmental agencies. I knew every square inch of that land. Without my signature and my rigorous oversight, Green Valley was nothing more than a very expensive, highly illegal pile of toxic dirt. Everything functioned as a well-oiled, legally compliant machine until the unfortunate arrival of Sterling Vance. Sterling was the son of a major board shareholder, arbitrarily dropped into the role of regional vice president like a spoiled prince inheriting a kingdom he fundamentally did not possess the intellect to understand. He was a man heavily addicted to the Silicon Valley executive aesthetic. He insisted on wearing overpriced black turtlenecks in the blistering Texas heat, drank artisanal iced matcha lattes, and constantly abused empty corporate buzzwords like disruptive thinking, agile synergy, and paradigm shifts. The tragic, incredibly dangerous irony was that this man, who was now supposed to oversee a monumental architectural and environmental endeavor, could not even read a basic technical blueprint. To Sterling, load-bearing walls and protected environmental hazard zones were just annoying. Abstract lines on a piece of paper that interfered with his visionary profit margins. He genuinely believed that if you spoke confidently enough, the laws of physics and strict federal regulations would simply bend to your will. Almost immediately after moving into his corner office, Sterling made it his personal mission to squeeze every possible dime out of the Green Valley project. He relentlessly pressured me to cut costs on crucial eco-friendly materials, demanding that we switch to cheaper, non-compliant alternatives simply to artificially inflate his quarterly financial reports and impress his wealthy father's friends on the board. I warned him repeatedly. I sent him meticulously detailed legal memos explaining that violating federal environmental codes would inevitably result in catastrophic fines, massive corporate lawsuits, and immediate project suspension. He ignored every single one of my warnings. During one particularly excruciating morning meeting, he actually leaned across the mahogany boardroom table, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Sienna, you need to stop being so rigid and start demonstrating some disruptive thinking. We are here to make money, not save the trees." I did not argue. Arguing with a man whose entire ego is subsidized by his family's generational wealth is a profound waste of precious calories. Instead, I simply nodded and smiled a thin, meticulously polite smile. But every time he issued a reckless directive, every time he casually dismissed a critical federal safety standard just to save a few pennies, I quietly recorded his exact words, the date, and the precise time into a gray suede notebook. That gray suede notebook was my constant, silent companion. It was the absolute, undeniable record of his breathtaking incompetence, a tangible ledger of every idiotic, illegal demand he ever made. I never corrected him in public. I let him bask in the false, glowing glory of his own perceived genius. Let him play his shallow corporate games, I thought to myself, while I went to work on the real chessboard. Because Sterling was entirely too busy planning his next visionary keynote speech and hosting endless networking lunches to pay attention to the tedious, exhausting financial paperwork. I took it upon myself to restructure the project funding agreement with the private investment board. I handled the brutal, highly complex negotiations directly with Vanguard Partners, our primary financial backers, completely bypassing Sterling and leaving his name off the email chains. Vanguard Partners was a ruthless financial entity. They did not care about corporate synergy. They cared solely about mitigating investment risk. I exploited their intense financial paranoia to my absolute advantage. In that heavily amended, deeply complex agreement, sealed tightly with the private investors behind closed doors, I secretly planted a flawless mousetrap. It was a highly specific, totally customized clause buried deep within hundreds of pages of dense legal jargon. This clause directly linked the project's financial default status to the specific legal standing of the project's key authorized personnel. I built a silent, invisible ticking time bomb out of legal ink and pristine white paper, and Sterling Vance was completely oblivious to the fact that he was standing right on the trigger. It was a Friday morning in late October when the execution took place. The autumn air outside the towering floor-to-ceiling windows was crisp and unforgiving, much like the atmosphere rapidly chilling inside the corporate headquarters. I had just finished my second cup of black coffee and was deep into reviewing a soil toxicity report when my desk phone rang. It was not a scheduled call. There had been no prior warning. No passive-aggressive emails from human resources regarding my performance, and certainly no calendar invites. Just a brief, sterile voice from an executive assistant telling me to report immediately to the main glass conference room on the top floor. In the corporate world, a sudden summons to the glass room on a Friday morning only ever means one thing. It is the corporate equivalent of being led to the guillotine. I walked down the long, heavily carpeted hallway, my footsteps absorbed by the expensive fabric. The silence in that corridor was always suffocating, designed to make you feel small before you even entered the room. When I pushed open the heavy glass door, the setup was exactly as I had anticipated. Sterling Vance was seated comfortably at the head of the massive mahogany table, casually leaning back in his ergonomic leather chair. Next to him sat a severe-looking woman from Human Resources, her hands folded neatly over a pristine manila folder. The air conditioning was cranked up so high that the room felt like a meat locker, an intentional psychological tactic to keep the soon-to-be-terminated employee off balance and shivering. Sterling did not even have the professional courtesy to look up immediately. He was busy typing away on his phone, a self-satisfied half-smile playing on his lips. Beside his phone rested a freshly opened bottle of imported, ridiculously expensive mineral water, the condensation dripping slowly down the glass. Finally, he locked his screen, placed the phone face down, and looked at me. His smile widened into a condescending smirk. He took a long, deliberate sip of his water, letting the silence stretch out, attempting to assert his dominance in the room. "Sienna," he began, his voice dripping with that fake, practiced empathy they teach in low-level management seminars. "Take a seat. We need to have a brief discussion about the future trajectory of the Green Valley project." He steepled his fingers together, a gesture he likely practiced in the mirror. "As you know, the real estate market is highly dynamic. We are pivoting. The project requires a much more flexible vision moving forward. To be entirely candid, your rigid adherence to archaic compliance structures and your fundamental inability to embrace our new agile methodology is severely slowing down the velocity of our capital. We need a team player who understands that cash flow is king. He was firing me because I refused to let him build luxury condos on environmentally protected wetlands. It was as simple as that. He nodded smoothly to the human resources representative, who immediately slid the manila folder across the polished wood surface toward me. She opened it to reveal a standard separation agreement. Effective immediately. Your employment with Aura Prime Development is terminated, the human resources woman stated in a flat, robotic tone. We require you to hand over all company laptops, encrypted hard drives, and the original physical copies of the federal permits within the next 10 minutes. In exchange for your full cooperation and a signed non-disclosure agreement, the company is prepared to offer you a standard severance package of 2 months of base salary. 2 months? It was a completely laughable, insulting number for a director-level executive who had just secured $2 billion in compliant operational runway. Sterling leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto my face, eagerly waiting for the reaction. He wanted the breakdown. He wanted the tears, the screaming, the desperate pleading, or the furious slamming of fists against the table. He wanted the visceral satisfaction of completely breaking the woman who had dared to tell him no. Instead of giving him that satisfaction, I felt an icy, absolute calm wash over me. The suffocating tension in the room simply evaporated from my shoulders. I looked down at the severance agreement, then back up at Sterling. I did not frown. I did not yell. I simply offered him a very light, serene smile. It was the kind of smile you give to a toddler who is proudly showing off a mud pie. I reached into my blazer pocket, pulled out my silver fountain pen, and uncapped it with a soft click. Without hesitating for even a fraction of a second, I pressed the nib to the paper and signed my name with a single, decisive, flowing stroke, S-I-E-N-N-A. The human resources representative blinked, clearly taken aback by the lack of resistance. Sterling looked momentarily confused, his smirk faltering just a fraction as I calmly stood up from the chair. I walked out of the glass room and headed straight back to my office to pack my belongings. I did not take the useless corporate trinkets or the branded coffee mugs. I packed precisely 2 items. First, I carefully secured my heavy, antique, copper-plated drawing tube. Inside that tube rested the sole original, wet ink copy of the heavily amended funding agreement I had negotiated with Vanguard Partners. Second, I picked up my gray suede notebook, slipping it safely into my leather tote bag. I walked back toward the elevator banks, fully aware that Sterling had stepped out of the conference room and was watching me leave, surrounded by a few of his sycophant junior executives. As the elevator doors chimed and began to slide open, I stopped. I turned around slowly and met his gaze from down the hallway. The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Sterling," I called out, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the quiet hum of the office floor. "I truly hope you read Clause 14.2 very carefully before you signed off on that massive disbursement package last week." For a split second, a flicker of genuine confusion crossed his face. Then, his massive ego overrode his severely limited intellect. He scoffed loudly, waving his hand in the air with a theatrical gesture of absolute dismissal. He turned to his junior executives, laughing, completely writing off my parting words as the cheap, desperate threat of a bitter, defeated loser. As the elevator doors closed, cutting off my view of the floor, the last thing I saw was Sterling pulling out his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen as he undoubtedly sent a celebratory message to the board of directors group chat, bragging that he had finally taken out the trash. He had no idea the building was already burning. While I was miles away quietly enjoying my freedom, Monday morning at Aura Prime Development arrived with the subtlety of a runaway freight train. At precisely 8 in the morning, an automated priority email bypassed all standard corporate spam filters and landed simultaneously in the inbox of every single member of the board of directors. It was not a friendly weekly performance update. The sender was an automated dual routing system configured directly by the Office of the Mayor of Austin, paired seamlessly with the strictly monitored risk management division of Vanguard Partners. The subject line alone was enough to induce immediate heart palpitations across the entire executive floor. It formally announced the immediate and indefinite suspension of all construction permits for the Green Valley project. Furthermore, it declared an absolute, impenetrable freeze on the Phase 2 disbursement fund. We were not talking about a minor administrative delay that could be fixed with a few phone calls to local politicians. This was a hard, unbreakable lock on $800 million of liquid capital. The stated reason for this massive financial blockade was brutally simple: a severe, unmitigated violation of the core personnel covenant. Chaos erupted instantly. The top floor transformed from a quiet, temperature-controlled sanctuary of wealth into a frantic war zone. The legal department, utterly blindsided by the notification, went into a state of absolute overdrive. Telephones began ringing constantly, creating a chaotic symphony of incoming panic. Junior lawyers and senior partners alike were frantically tearing through digital archives and pulling the heavy physical binders of the master funding agreement. They desperately scoured hundreds of pages of dense text until a pale, visibly sweating paralegal finally found the epicenter of the blast. It was Clause 14.2. The legal language was ironclad, leaving zero room for interpretation, negotiation, or corporate maneuvering. It stated clearly that the chief architect and director of environmental compliance, explicitly naming Sienna Rivera, was classified as a key, irreplaceable entity vital to the structural integrity and legal liability of the project. If I was to be replaced, reassigned, or terminated without the explicit, written approval of the investment board submitted at least 30 days in advance, the entire project would immediately enter a state of technical default. But the true horror for Aura Prime was not just the humiliating default status, it was the devastating financial punishment attached to it. The penalty for triggering this specific technical default was not a standard warning or a temporary hold on assets. It was a brutal, compounding daily fine. Aura Prime Development was legally obligated to pay a penalty of $250,000 for every single business day the project remained stalled. And the most terrifying part for the executives reading that document: the clock did not start when they received the email. The penalty was completely retroactive, calculating from the exact minute my fountain pen lifted from the termination paper on Friday morning. The chief legal officer, a man whose blood pressure was directly tied to the stability of the company's stock price, did not bother sending an urgent email. He did not schedule a crisis meeting. He marched straight out of the legal suite, his face a tight mask of pure, unadulterated fury, and stormed directly toward the regional vice presidential suite. He did not even bother to knock. He kicked the heavy oak door open, startling Sterling Vance so badly that the young executive dropped his stylus. Sterling was sitting comfortably at his desk, likely still basking in the false glow of his supposed victory from Friday. Before Sterling could even open his mouth to reprimand the aggressive intrusion, the chief legal officer slammed the heavily highlighted contract down on the pristine desk. With a violent, uncontrolled sweep of his arm, he smashed Sterling's expensive ceramic coffee mug against the wall, sending dark liquid and sharp shards flying across the expensive carpet. "Did you even bother to read the documents you signed 2 weeks ago?" the chief legal officer roared, his voice shaking with absolute rage. "Or did you just skip straight to the profit-sharing margins? You absolute fool! You just triggered a financial landmine that is bleeding us dry." All the color instantly drained from Sterling's perfectly tanned face. His arrogant smirk vanished completely, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed look of a man who suddenly realizes he has stepped blindly onto a trapdoor. He frantically grabbed the contract, his eyes darting wildly across the dense legal text he fundamentally did not possess the capacity to understand. The crushing reality of his colossal mistake crashed down on him. His hands began to tremble violently. In a state of pure, suffocating panic, he snatched his smartphone and frantically dialed my personal number. He held the phone tight against his ear, his breath catching in his throat. desperately hoping I would answer and somehow fix the catastrophic mess he had confidently created. Instead, he was met with nothing but the long, mechanical beep of an automated voicemail system. The trap had snapped shut. The relentless countdown clock had officially started ticking, and every single time the sun rose, it was going to cost his father's company another $250,000. By the time the sun rose on Wednesday morning, the corporate bleeding had escalated from a severe arterial gash into a full-blown financial hemorrhage. The running penalty had effortlessly hit the $750,000 mark. To make matters infinitely worse for the executive floor, the sudden freeze on the disbursement funds had triggered an automated red alert within the Federal Oversight Network. Down in Austin, the dusty, sprawling construction site of Green Valley was abruptly invaded by a massive fleet of unmarked white government vehicles. Stern-looking inspectors from the Department of Energy stepped out, armed with heavy clipboards, yellow hard hats, and absolute federal authority. They systematically marched across the property and shut down every single excavator, crane, and bulldozer in sight. They began placing bright yellow regulatory locks on the steering wheels of the heavy machinery. The site managers were frantically calling headquarters, screaming into their radios, demanding to know why federal agents were crawling all over their pristine dirt piles and threatening them with immediate federal arrest if they moved a single shovelful of soil. The entire $2 billion operation was utterly paralyzed. Up on the top floor of Aura Prime, Sterling Vance was rapidly deteriorating. The polished, arrogant prince of corporate synergy had completely unraveled. His perfectly tailored designer suits suddenly looked 2 sizes too big. His hair was a mess, and the dark, heavy bags under his eyes suggested he had not slept a single minute since Monday. Trapped in a terrifying corner of his own catastrophic making, he decided to execute what he genuinely believed was a stroke of absolute disruptive genius. In reality, it was the single most fatally stupid maneuver in modern corporate history. Driven by pure, unfiltered panic, Sterling called his terrified, 22-year-old secretary into his office and locked the door. He ordered the poor girl, who was practically hyperventilating, to draft a fake internal consensus document. The forged memorandum stated clearly that I had willingly and voluntarily transferred my core compliance authority back to the regional management team prior to my departure. He instructed the shaking assistant to deliberately backdate the document to the previous Thursday, safely 24 hours before my sudden termination. But a fake document is entirely useless without a signature. Sterling, operating under the profound delusion that a multinational investment firm possessed the security protocols of a suburban high school, grabbed an old routine environmental impact report from his desk drawer. He literally instructed his secretary to scan my physical signature from the old report, crop it digitally, and paste it directly onto the bottom of his newly fabricated transition memo. He reviewed the fraudulent file on his high-definition monitor, proudly admired his own criminal handiwork, and confidently emailed it directly to the strict compliance department at Vanguard Partners, hoping it would magically unlock the $800 million vault. This is exactly where the dark, beautiful comedy of his profound ignorance truly blossomed. Sterling fundamentally misunderstood the level of the game we were playing. He did not know that for the past 14 months, I had exclusively signed every single legally binding document for the Green Valley project using a highly specialized, custom-ordered fountain pen. The barrel of the pen was not filled with standard ink. It was filled with a proprietary, military-grade biometric ink. It was an advanced digital microchip technology specifically designed to combat high-level corporate forgery. Embedded within the liquid ink were microscopic cryptographic signatures that reacted uniquely to the pressure of my hand and embedded a permanent, invisible digital timestamp directly into the paper fibers. To the naked human eye, it looked like standard, elegant black ink. To an advanced optical scanner, it looked like a glowing cryptographic barcode. When Sterling confidently fired off his heavily compressed, horribly pasted file to Vanguard Partners, their automated compliance scanning system digested the document in less than a second. The artificial intelligence immediately recognized that the digital signature lacked the required cryptographic microtags. Furthermore, it recognized that the visual pattern of the signature was an exact pixel-by-pixel duplicate of a document submitted 7 months prior. The system did not just flag the document for human review, it triggered a massive automated federal fraud alert. In the span of about 45 seconds, Sterling Vance successfully upgraded a very expensive internal contract dispute into a massive, highly illegal act of federal wire fraud and attempted corporate embezzlement. The fallout was beautifully instantaneous and catastrophically violent. Vanguard Partners immediately notified the Securities and Exchange Commission. Whispers of a looming Federal Bureau of Investigation probe leaked into the financial press by the early afternoon. The stock market, always eager to punish corporate incompetence, reacted with brutal efficiency. The publicly traded stock of Aura Prime Development went into an absolute terrifying freefall. In a single, chaotic afternoon trading session, their total market valuation evaporated by a staggering 12%. Billions of dollars in shareholder wealth vanished into thin air simply because a deeply unqualified man thought he could use basic photo editing software to outsmart federal law. The board of directors, a group of notoriously ruthless elderly billionaires who were currently watching their own personal retirement portfolios catch fire in real time, convened an emergency, mandatory session via secure video link. There was no polite corporate language used during this meeting. There was no talk of agile synergy or pivoting strategies. The board voted unanimously and ruthlessly. Within 20 minutes of the stock market closing bell, 2 massive, heavily armed corporate security guards entered the regional vice presidential suite. They did not hand Sterling a severance package. They did not give him 10 minutes to pack a cardboard box. They immediately deactivated his keycard, confiscated his company smartphone right out of his trembling hands, and physically grabbed him by the arms. As they forcibly marched him out of his luxurious glass office and dragged him down the long corridor toward the freight elevator. Sterling completely lost his mind. His voice echoed wildly through the silent, terrified office floor. He was thrashing violently against the guards, kicking his expensive leather shoes, and screaming at the top of his lungs, desperately trying to blame the entire catastrophic mess on the Human Resources Department. It was a spectacular, deeply humiliating public execution for a man who had confidently laughed at me just 5 days prior. 1,000 miles away from the shattered glass, the blaring security alarms, and the screaming executives of Texas, I was breathing in the crisp, perfectly filtered air of the Colorado Rocky Mountains. I was sitting comfortably on the expansive, sunlit wooden deck of a 5-star eco-resort, a freshly salted margarita resting lightly in my hand. The ice clinked gently against the crystal glass, providing a stark, beautiful contrast to the chaotic sound of smashing coffee mugs I imagined was currently echoing through my former office floor. My personal cell phone sat on the small cedar table next to me, completely silent. The screen would occasionally light up with a frantic incoming call, but I had deliberately configured my settings to automatically block and decline any unassigned or unknown numbers. I knew exactly who was desperately trying to breach my peace, and I had absolutely no intention of making it easy for them to find salvation. I was not entirely disconnected from the corporate battlefield. However, while Aura Prime Development was busy rapidly self-destructing, I had my high-definition tablet propped up in front of me, engaged in a heavily encrypted, highly confidential video conference. On the other side of the screen sat the senior acquisition team of Apex Dynamics. Apex was the largest, most aggressively predatory competitor in the North American commercial real estate sector. They were currently circling the bleeding carcass of the Green Valley project like a pack of starving wolves, eagerly anticipating a massive, heavily discounted fire sale the exact moment Aura Prime officially declared bankruptcy. The Apex executives spoke in hushed, greedy tones, mapping out their aggressive buyout strategy and discussing how cheaply they could acquire the paralyzed heavy machinery and the suspended permits. I listened patiently, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my drink. I let them exhaust their predatory fantasies, before I leaned forward and fundamentally changed the entire geometry of their master plan. I calmly explained to the Apex Board of Directors that acquiring the physical land and the frozen corporate assets would be entirely useless without one highly specific, absolutely non-transferable legal asset. I told them about the proprietary biometric ink. I explained the legally ironclad, incredibly dense phrasing of the compliance covenants I had personally drafted. I looked directly into the camera lens and informed them that the sole, exclusive key to unlocking the $800 million vault and lifting the catastrophic daily federal fines was my personal, voluntary, written consent. In that singular moment, the dynamic in the virtual room shifted entirely. The smug expressions dropped from their faces, replaced by stunned silence. I was no longer an unemployed architect seeking a new job. I had instantly become the most valuable, untouchable commodity in the entire industry. I held the absolute power of life and death over a $2 billion empire, and they knew it. By Thursday afternoon, the desperation back at Aura Prime headquarters had reached its absolute zenith. The daily penalties were compounding. The federal agents were unyielding, and they had exhausted every single legal loophole and desperate political backchannel. They had no choice but to completely surrender to the woman they had casually thrown out like garbage. The profound silence of the mountain resort was abruptly shattered by the heavy rhythmic thumping of military-grade rotor blades. A sleek, matte black private helicopter descended rapidly from the sky, landing heavily on the private helipad just beyond the resort boundaries. It was the personal transport of the chairman of the board of Aura Prime Development. He was an incredibly powerful, deeply arrogant billionaire who normally summoned world leaders to his private island, not the other way around. He strode into the grand, timber-framed lobby of the resort, clutching a sleek leather briefcase, demanding loudly to the front desk that he see me immediately. When the highly discreet concierge called my luxury suite to inform me of his frantic arrival, I did not rush downstairs to greet him. I remembered the condescending smiles in that freezing glass conference room. I remembered the insulting 10-minute deadline they gave me to pack my life into a cheap cardboard box. So, I politely asked the concierge to inform the chairman that I was currently indisposed and would be with him shortly. Then, I walked directly to the resort wellness center and enjoyed a deeply relaxing, meticulously slow hot stone massage that lasted exactly 2 hours. I deliberately let the most powerful man in commercial real estate sit on a decorative lobby sofa, helplessly checking his diamond watch every 30 seconds, sweating profusely through his custom-tailored Italian suit, while his company bled hundreds of thousands of dollars with every passing minute he waited. When I finally descended the grand staircase, radiating absolute tranquility and smelling faintly of expensive eucalyptus oil, the chairman practically leaped to his feet. He did not offer any empty corporate buzzwords. He bypassed the traditional, fake pleasantries entirely. He simply unclasped his heavy leather briefcase and slid a thick, pristine document across the polished stone coffee table toward me. It was a completely blank concession contract. He was a broken man, physically begging. He looked me in the eyes, his voice strained with pure exhaustion and genuine terror, and asked what it would take to make the financial bleeding stop. I did not even glance at the blank paper. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my voice steady and completely devoid of any sympathy. I have absolutely no interest in your standard severance pay or your empty apologies, I told him coldly. My terms are absolute. I demand total, unmitigated operational control of the entire Green Valley project, reporting to absolutely no one but the investment board. I demand 15% preferred equity in the final profit margins. And finally, before I even consider reaching for my pen to save your company, I demand a very specific head delivered to me on a silver platter. The following Monday morning arrived with the heavy, undeniable weight of a final reckoning. It was exactly day 10 since I had been casually dismissed from that very same building, and as my private car pulled up to the curb, the devastating financial penalty had officially crossed the absolute threshold of $2.5 million. I stepped out into the bright Texas sunlight, smoothing down the lapels of my tailored navy suit. I did not enter through the side door or the parking garage. I walked straight through the grand, expansive marble lobby of Aura Prime Development. The atmosphere inside the building was fundamentally different now. The air was thick with palpable anxiety. The security guards, who previously would have demanded to see my corporate identification, immediately stepped aside and held the security gates open for me, their eyes fixed firmly on the polished floor. I rode the executive elevator in total silence, watching the floor numbers climb higher and higher, returning to the exact scene of the crime. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the main top-floor conference room. It was the precise location where, just over a week ago, they had tried to bury me. The scene before me was a cinematic masterpiece of corporate submission. The chairman of the board, flanked by the chief legal officer and every single senior vice president in the regional division, was already waiting. As I crossed the threshold, a profound, unprompted shift in the power dynamic occurred, without a single word being spoken. The chairman stood up from his leather chair. Immediately following his lead, every other deeply powerful, highly paid executive in the room rose to their feet. They remained standing in tense silence as I calmly walked toward the head of the massive mahogany table. I pulled out the premier leather chair, the one previously occupied by the man who had fired me, and sat down. Only then did the rest of the room dare to lower themselves back into their seats. I did not offer a polite greeting. I reached into my leather tote bag and withdrew my two most vital possessions. First, I pulled out the heavy, antique copper-plated drawing tube. Second, I withdrew the weathered gray suede notebook. I placed them both down on the center of the polished wood table, in the suffocating, dead silence of that terrified room. The heavy thud of the copper and the slap of the leather binding echoed off the glass walls like the undeniable strike of a judge hitting a wooden gavel. The time for negotiation had ended in Colorado. This was the execution of terms. I slowly unscrewed the cap of the copper tube and carefully slid out the pristine white pages of a special regulatory addendum. It was the master key. I uncapped my fountain pen. The very same pen equipped with the biometric digital ink that had previously triggered a massive federal fraud alert and smoothed the paper flat. Under the desperate, unblinking gaze of a dozen ruined executives, I signed my name. With that single, decisive stroke of wet ink, I officially released the Green Valley project from the Vanguard Partners funding freeze. I instantly called off the Department of Energy inspectors, deactivated the massive daily financial penalties, and miraculously pulled the entire $2 billion enterprise back from the absolute brink of corporate bankruptcy at the 89th minute. I pushed the signed addendum across the table toward the trembling chief legal officer before he could even utter a word of relief. I slid a second, much thicker document directly toward the chairman. "That is my new employment agreement," I stated, my voice echoing with cold, absolute authority. "As of this exact second, Sienna Rivera is no longer a mid-level director. I am officially the managing partner of the Green Valley Development. I retain absolute, uncontested operational veto power over every single architectural and environmental decision. Furthermore, I now hold 15% of the preferred equity in the final project profit margins, and my chain of command completely bypasses the regional structure. I report exclusively and directly to the chairman of the board." The executives around the table swallowed hard, but not a single one raised an objection. They knew the cost of defiance, but there was still one final, crucial thread to tie. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the gray suede notebook. "And now, we address the matter of the forged signature and the looming threat of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," I continued, locking eyes with the chairman. This was the twist that completely broke the back of the enemy. I knew that the board of directors, a group of ruthless billionaires, would always choose their own survival over loyalty. To secure my absolute silence and ensure I never handed over the undeniable digital evidence of Sterling Vance committing federal wire fraud to the authorities, I forced the board to cannibalize one of their own. I demanded that the board immediately confiscate the entirety of the Vance family's internal corporate shares. Every single dime of generational equity held by Sterling's father was aggressively liquidated and entirely seized by the company to directly compensate for the $2.5 million in federal fines that his idiot son had accrued. The Vance family was entirely stripped of their power, humiliated, and financially decimated by their own peers in a matter of minutes. An hour later, the climax of my return played out beautifully in the executive hallway. I was standing inside my massive new corner office, arranging my desk, when I heard the heavy footsteps outside. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, I watched Sterling Vance executing his final walk of absolute shame. He was physically carrying a cheap, recycled cardboard box filled with his pathetic desk trinkets. His expensive designer suit rumpled, his face pale and completely devoid of his former arrogant smirk. He was flanked on both sides by two massive, unsmiling corporate security guards, strictly ensuring he did not touch a single company asset on his way out. He paused for a fraction of a second as he walked past my glass wall. He looked in, utterly broken, a fallen prince expelled from his own kingdom. I did not grant him the satisfaction of a gloating smile. I did not even make eye contact. I completely ignored his existence. I calmly opened my gray suede notebook to the very last page of his recorded failures. I picked up a red ink pen, pressed it firmly against the paper, and drew a single, thick, red line straight through the name Sterling Vance. I closed the book, shut the chapter on the past, and turned my attention toward the massive Texas skyline, ready to rule the $2 billion empire I had just brutally conquered. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. I would absolutely love to know where you are listening from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging and want to help keep this channel alive, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon. There, you can listen to our very best, highly exclusive true stories that are simply too intense to publish publicly on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description and the pinned comment below. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next story.